let's go ahead and kick off.
Sounds good.
We'll have more folks join as they come in, but thanks everybody who's here for jumping back in, and thanks again to you, Mike, for the awesome presentation on Wednesday and for agreeing to make some time to do a little live Q&A, AMA style follow-up from the webinar. So this live Q&A session is following on a webinar called Test Automation in the Real World, presented by Mike Maliska here. He's a senior QA engineer and automation architect at PrismHR. And what we're going to do in this session is totally informal, chat through some of the questions that people asked at the webinar that was hosted on Wednesday, September 15th. We will also take other questions from folks who have shown up during this live Q&A. So we'll start with a couple of the questions from the webinar. And then if you have any questions from the webinar for folks that are on the call, feel free to go ahead and put those in the Q&A section in the Zoom webinar here, and let us know if you want me to ask the question on your behalf, or if you want to come on Mike and we can just have a little chat and you can talk to Mike yourself about any questions that you have. We are recording this so that everybody knows, and we'll send a link to this recording to all of the folks that attended the webinar, as well as the folks that had registered for the webinar but didn't make it on Wednesday, just because we think a lot of the questions that are here are going to be really helpful. So I think that's it. Mike, am I missing anything?
No, I think that's good. I think you got it.
Cool. All right. So first question from the webinar I just had up. I think it was a question about the infrastructure that y'all actually use to run your automation.
Okay, yeah. So the question I think I saw here was, what's the infrastructure used to run the tests? And do you call the TestRail API in Jenkins or from Python? So our infrastructure has grown over time, but in essence, we use Jenkins as a way to pull down our infrastructure code that then runs, which also, and that code that runs the infrastructure can do multiple steps, which then in turn also pulls down our automation code. So I know that's a few steps there, but in short, you can build your infrastructure larger and larger. You can start with saying, what I really need to do is pull down my testing framework. I need to make sure that I have my tests. Some people keep their tests as part of their own framework. Some people keep the framework and tests separate, but you need to pull down the framework and tests and make sure they're ready to be put onto an environment and ready to run. We use Jenkins for that. Our framework happens to be Python based, so we make sure that when we use Jenkins to pull down our framework, it's being pulled down onto a system that has Python pre-installed on it. But if you're using a Java-based framework, that's fine. Other people are not pulling down the framework directly. They're just using Jenkins to call a script that will call the framework to run. So some people may already have their framework up, running, installed, but you're using Jenkins to make a call to that framework to run. So in essence, the infrastructure that runs my tests and will run your tests kind of depends on what you're using to what your framework is. So again, ours is in Python, in PyTest. A lot of people use Java and TestNG. You may already have that. You can pull that right down out of the repository, build it and run it. Other people may have a product that's already set up where you're using a web product to do kind of like a record and playback of Selenium. And if you have that, you're still using Jenkins. Jenkins just making a call to that to run that. Now, the question as far as whether Jenkins or Python is calling the APIs for TestRail, the answer is both. And what I mean by that is Jenkins, I may, in our case, where we have a more sophisticated framework, I want to do things like I'm going to create a test plan And then I'm going to run tests that then update that test plan, right? So the Jenkins server pulls down my code that knows how to do things like create a test plan. And that will call the APIs to build that test plan. I then use more TestRail APIs to call TestRail to say, well, what are the tests that I need to run? I pass that list of test cases over to my test automation system and say, run those tests. Now, as my test automation system is running, one of the things I give to my test automation system is the information about my test plan, or really test run that I'm running. And as my Python is running and passing and failing tests, it knows to call the API on TestRail to update that to a pass or fail or retest, or and you can decide what you want to do. In our case, we always mark things as a retest because we want eyes to go on it. We don't really know that truly that it failed, right? So we mark it as a retest. That's just what we do. So I hope that answers the question, right? That it's really a combination of both, but the APIs are there to be called by any of these platforms. And to be honest, also, Jenkins is, for the much of that people hear about Jenkins and as a great tool it is, it's actually kind of really, I'm going to say dumb, right? Jenkins is a great thing, but at the end of the day, it's a workflow engine. And you probably have some code that says, hey, Jenkins, I want to go collect some information, pull my code down, and then run those scripts. That's what Jenkins is doing for you.
That was awesome. I think really helpful. One follow-up question to that, and I think this question is tough because I assume the answer is it's always going to depend on your setup, but in terms of the actual infrastructure where you have it's not production code yet, like the code that the test automation and PyTest is actually running against, wherever your application is at whatever stage of development, do y'all have some way of setting up that test infrastructure that the test automation is running against, or is that all happening in Jenkins?
Okay, so you're right that sometimes that depends. So I think when we looked at that slide, we talked about automation versus automation, and whether it's test automation and there's this. So we have a team called the ops team, and they're responsible for making sure that our code, and I mean our product code, is checked out of a repository. It's built, it builds the artifacts. Those artifacts could be Docker containers. Those artifacts could be Java jars. Those artifacts could be executables. But we now need to deploy those artifacts onto our production servers. So at that point, some of our building of that code is actually done in a product called Bamboo, which is basically a Jenkins. Then we use some Jenkins to kick off scripts, which will take those artifacts and deploy them onto these systems and get them up and running, make sure the services restart the microservices, so forth. That is usually handled by our ops team, meaning that actual scripting and what needs to be done is handled by our ops team. We have a build and release team that handles the building of those artifacts. That same pipeline gets to a point and then says, now I'd like to go and run the test automation job. And it passes the test automation job some information like, oh, test automation, I just deployed a new version of X software and I deployed it to DB50. That's just one of our servers. We call it DB50. So DB51, 52, 53. So the existing software that builds it can then call our software. In our case, the build systems, the deployment systems of the artifact have one Jenkins server. The test automation team has their own Jenkins server. You don't need it. They can all be the same. You can have it too. We do that so that when we're in there creating automation jobs, you're less likely to go in and break something by mistake. And the ops team is less likely to come into our server and break something by mistake. So, but these Jenkins servers can talk to each other through a simple API. As far as the other question, I think it may have been implied in that question, is where does the test case actually run? So in our case, our software is software as a service. It's up there in the cloud. When we run our framework, we actually spin up a Linux server. We make sure Python's installed on that Linux server. We pull down our framework, which again is Python based. We make sure that our test framework is there. We make sure our tests are there. We manipulate a config file that says, by the way, this is the test, this is the server that you will be testing, which is DB51 or something. Again, this is the test plan you'll be updating in TestRail, right? Because TestRail is on its own server. And so our framework is actually running not directly on our production server, it's running on its own server, but pointing to our production server. There are reasons why sometimes you will actually have to make sure that your test code is on the same server. If your test code doesn't have APIs available, doesn't have a web interface, you literally have to be on the same server because you're looking through directories for file system stuff. Yeah, that has to be on the same system. The majority of the time, that's not the case, though. Okay.
That's great. One other quick follow-up question to that, and then I see we're getting some Q&A coming in from the attendees that I want to jump into. There was someone else asked yesterday, in terms of where you keep your automation code, like the framework code and the tests, you just mentioned that you have those separate. Are those, and again, this is all going to be like, this is what your team does, maybe not for everybody, but how do y'all approach that? Is it in the same GitHub repository or Bitbucket repository? Do you have different repositories? Sure. And why did you decide to do what you did there from kind of a workflow perspective? Sure.
So I've definitely worked at many different, I worked at Dell EMC, and within Dell EMC, we had different teams that worked in different formats. So there is no right or wrong answer about whether you keep the tests with your product code or not. However, I find it more often than not, there has to be very specific circumstances to keep the tests with the product code. Unit tests have to be kept with the product code. That just makes the most sense. It's there. You're taking that code, you're bringing it down, you're compiling it, you're running your unit tests right there. So that's always kept with the product code. If you're doing some integration testing, or you're doing some end-to-end testing, or you're trying to test a deployment, that I find is usually better to keep those in a separate repository. And the reason why I say that is because your finished product may be 2 or 3 microservices that are working together, or your finished product is a UI that comes up that you are calling and you're walking through some menus, and you actually may be behind the scenes hitting different artifacts. Now, those artifacts were probably built from different repositories. So your build and release team is taking this repository to build this microservice, this repository to build that microservice, and it can get very confusing very quickly. Oh, I want to run this test. That test is actually hitting 3 or 4 different microservices. So where do you put that test? Which repository should that test belong to? So in our case, we have a repository that we put all our automated tests in. Now, with that, we have several product lines, right? So you guys know I work for Prism, but Prism has several different kinds of products. We have a client-based product. We have an ePay product. We call what we call Core Prism. And even within Core Prism, there's 4 or 5 different sub-applications. The Core Prism has a repo. ePay has a repo. ClientSpace has a repo. I'm not saying that every single little thing needs its own repo, but it seems it's usually the case that you want to group them and you keep them separate from the product code. That is usually the best case. Again, unless you're talking about unit testing, or your microservice can be stood up all by itself and deployed, and you want those tests. Now, on top of that, I will say two things. One thing that works best for our particular group, because we have a lot of groups and we want one framework that says this framework can handle our API testing, it can handle UI testing, it can handle unit testing. We have our framework in its own repository, and then each group has their tests in another. So when we deploy and want to run our tests, we always say, go get the release version of our framework, and then we can reach in and grab each set of tests for the product that we're going to test. Depending on your size, that is a more complicated scenario, because what happens there is you're building a pipeline that has to understand how to get the repositories, and then you have to put them onto the systems, and you have to configure those two things to talk to each other. Most people, when they're starting out with automation, and this is certainly the way I started out, is you build your framework, your tests are really kind of part of your framework, and you're not separating them at all. By the time you realize that there's a good reason to separate them, you have enough knowledge and how it works to be able to pull them apart. So yeah, we do keep them separate, but that's because it's a more mature product. It's not wrong to keep them together, especially when you first start. And I will add one more thing, which is our infrastructure code, the code that drives that whole process, is in its own repository. Now, you don't have to have it on its own repository, right? Some people will build a Jenkins job, they'll build a Groovy, that happens to be the language that that Jenkins uses to create their pipelines. It's called Groovy. When you build those Groovy pipelines that do all of that, that can live right on your Jenkins server. I prefer to keep that also in a repository that says, when I run this job, pull that down and run this particular pipeline. But again, it's a more mature process. Doesn't mean you have to start that way. I hope that answered some of that question.
Yeah, that was great. It's just a quick follow-up on that. It doesn't sound like you use any other tools out of the box like Browser Stack or Sauce Labs or anything like that for the infrastructure, right?
So we do not. Doesn't mean we can't, right? So for example, Selenium Grid and Selenium can be difficult to maintain. And we have a pretty good mature group. So we have our own Selenium Grid. We maintain it. We had other projects where we didn't even use the grid. We had a Docker container spin up, and we always ran Chrome headless or Firefox headless inside the Docker container. And therefore, that test was running all by itself, and we were not pointing, we had no need for Sauce Labs and so forth. Our product, however, is mature enough that right now we point to a Selenium Grid that we maintain. We have a hub with some nodes, and I would say that unless you feel very comfortable with it, don't go that route. When you go to Sauce Labs or Browser Stack, they'll give you some information. We could, in our software now, change an API, change some login information, and we would point to the Browser Stack Selenium Grid. And what they're doing for you, and you're paying for this, by the way, you're paying for them to maintain those grids and maintain the latest versions of Chrome, and you're paying for all of that. Now, depending on your budget and depending on how often you need to test, that actually does make sense, right? It's kind of like you need to start that way, and then you sometimes you outgrow it, and sometimes you want to go back to that even after you go. So if you're testing, say, once a week, once a month, it does make sense. If you're doing like a very large regression test once a month, or a very large regression test once a week, that makes sense. We're running tests all day, every day. There's a check-in, we get deployed, we want to run some tests. We're doing it over and over and over. That becomes very expensive project in sauce labs and so forth. So we ended up, again, writing our own infrastructure to maintain that. But I don't want to make it sound like it doesn't. It's good, right? They offer a service. They just want to get paid for that service. But there is no reason why you can't plug into that.
Awesome. That's great. Actually, that was one of a couple of questions that Gregory asked. So Gregory, I will bring you off mute, and it sounds like you've got a lot of other, you've got some other really great questions. So let's see if this works. All right. Can we hear you now, Gregory?
Yes, Mike, really great presentation. I really enjoyed it. We actually use TestRails ourselves at Fox Corporation. And we have multiple groups, and they're very diverse groups as they use different frameworks throughout. And what we found with the TestRails, the challenge was to have a centralized reporting structure, similar to like Allure reports, if you're familiar with them, or something that has like a central dashboard that upper management can come in and look to see like what happens from all these executions from different teams. And we found it in TestRail to be a little difficult to have the overall report because it's per project. How do you deal with that?
Sure. Let me kind of show you. I'm going to share my screen here. Let me know if you guys can see my screen. You guys see my screen?
We can see a Google Chrome window.
All right. So obviously we use TestRail. We use TestRail because TestRail for us is the source of truth for our test cases. It makes it very easy for us to log in and see what's going on. So we're not debating on whether TestRail is the best thing, right, for our test case management, but I completely understand what you're saying. So let me come in here, and of course, this is always the way. I haven't logged in for a little bit. Let me log in. We have this dashboard. You heard me say that we had some different product groups, right? We have a client space and an ePay and a marketplace and Prism. So I'm going to click on Prism. Just this is my product family. One of the things that Prism does for us, and this, by the way, is Python backend. Django is what's serving these pages up with a little JavaScript built in. But one of the things that one of our teams also want to know often, so here I have this QA metrics. I'm going to go to that. They want to know, hey, what went into this release, right? What was the effort that went into getting this particular product out the door? So I'm going to hit this release info by milestone. And what this is when I'm done with the release, I run a script that hits the TestRail APIs. It goes through and it looks at all my test plans, and it looks for test plans that have had this milestone. You have to kind of have a little process down to it, but it takes all of these, puts them into a database for me. And the reason why I put it in a database is because you can see here, I hit refresh, this comes up instantly. I can look at these different things and I get these numbers instantly. If I was hitting the TestRail APIs every single time, it takes time to pull that information out. Plus, you can only get so many API calls in a minute. So we do this. But what you can see is my benefits team here versus my employee portal team versus my report center team. For this release, this is what we call a release work milestone, feature work, feature freeze, code freeze. How many test cases were automated for that particular project here. And this one you can see they ran nothing. But feature freeze, it was 86, 20 manual, 106 total. And you'll see where I'm going to go with this in a second. Let me try to move these little boxes around. And at the end, I can sit here and say, okay, in order to get this MR, that's our maintenance release, out the door in August, this benefit enrollment ran 375 tests, 170. I'm not clicking. To me, this is one TestRail project. This is another TestRail project. That's another TestRail project. So I'm going to go into TestRail, and you can see there's benefits, there's employee portal, there's onboarding, there's platform API. So there are times where I find it easier to pull that data out, put it into a database so that I can manipulate this in a variety of different ways. Now, what I like about this though, is I get this final product. I want to go look at Prism, see where it says additional information. I click that additional information link. It takes me to TestRail, and it shows me all the plans where I'm gathering those numbers from. And now if someone said, well, how did we do? 98% passing, we had 2 failures. I can start looking at these things, and I can actually dig in and dig into the test. But what our release manager sees at the get-go is this high-level thing right here. So without a doubt, we pull these in. Now, I'm going to show you one other thing. And I apologize for jumping around a little bit, but another thing.
Quick question. Do you use TestRail reporting or not?
We don't. We don't. So I'm going to show you one other thing here. This may make a little sense. So if I come to self-service, Prism, automation reports, you can see here on September 17th at 8:05, I ran what we call a custom marker, which really is just one test. I ran this one test. Or I ran Prism, and it was a TestRail ID, and this is, and if I click on that TestRail ID, oh, sorry, still loading, takes a minute. If I click on that TestRail ID, it'll take me to TestRail and take me right to that run where I can view it. And if I click on the screenshots, I can see the screenshots that were taken when there was a problem with this particular test. We actually embed screenshots on failure into TestRail as well. So you can see these. And then of course, this is what you referred to, where I have the report link. If I click on the report link, we used to have Allure reports when we were under Java. Now that we use Python, we use these PyTest reports where you can see the actual test results here. This is where we do the majority of our metrics. One other thing I will tell you that we do, and let me pull this out, which is going to make it a little bit. This is for our release. When we do release information, I'm going to hit reports, and I'm going to look at where this particular release. This is going to take about 30 to 45 seconds to load. Why? Because we're hitting the TestRail APIs heavily. I'm going through every single one of my TestRail projects right now, looking to see if they happen to have this release marker. If they have that release marker, do I have any plans for that? If I do have plans, what's my status? Now, we just haven't invested a lot of time in TestRail reports. Sometimes they work real good, and sometimes our QA team will use TestRail reports when they're trying to view things. But for our higher level management, we do not use TestRail reports, mainly because they want to see other things. Not only do they want to see other things, it may be tied into how many JIRAs have been closed and how many bugs do we have and where are we on test release. So we do these dashboards not because the TestRail reports aren't enough. Well, for tests, they're just not enough for everything they want to see. They want to see everything in one dashboard. And you can see here, we have these little icons, the smiley faces, and then I even tell you, all tests are marked as passed, conditional passed. So that's why I'm smiling. I'm done 100%. And if I click on that, sure, it takes me to my plan and shows me everything I ran.
Mike, what was the framework that you used to produce these reports? Is it
So-
just like a table in HTML or?
Yeah, so we're using JavaScript in common. Excuse me. We're using JavaScript in a combination of a product called Django, and Django is a Python-based framework that you can install. We could have installed Apache and used some JavaScript on this as well.
Okay.
So
But it's not like Grafana. It's not anything heavy duty like any of those out of the box
No.
reporting add-ons.
Yeah, and we did look at Grafana, and there's some issues with Grafana. Grafana is great for more performance, right? What's my CPU? What's my so forth. I've used Grafana to try to do some of these reports, but that didn't really work out for us. We used Tableau before, but again, the reason why we use a lot of these is because, as you can see here, if you come to some of these, I can come to different ones, and when I come here, I can have these different metrics, and I can even put in a link that takes me to my Jenkins server so I can run a job. And you can see here, when I went in here, there's a little post-it note. So our users log into this framework all the time, log into this dashboard. It tells them, hey, today's September 17th. It's a standard week. You should be working on sprint work. Oh, and by the way, make sure your wave day plans are ready. This is what you should be focused on, is these two things. Like, we do things like that. Again, our release management can come in here, and there'll be links to our Jira dashboards. You could as easily, if you have some TestRail reports, have this link to your TestRail report. So that's why we use this dashboard, is because it can take you to TestRail, it can take you to the kickoff framework, it can take you to Jira. What are you looking for? That's why we use it. It's, again, so I just apologize, I don't have a lot of experience using the TestRail reports.
No, that's a great point. I think one known limitation that we're looking into developing some feature functionality around is cross-project reporting. Right now, projects are the most basic unit of organization in TestRail, and it makes sense for a lot of teams to create separate projects for different product lines, or even sometimes different components within product lines. Although we typically recommend, when you're creating a new project, generally you want the same team or the same product for each project. But right now, TestRail only supports reporting outside of that dashboard activity report. It's more of a chart. Only supports reporting on a project by project level. So we're definitely looking into how we could, or first of all, like what folks would want in the cross project reporting, and it's great to see your team has built out some of that here.
Yeah, and one other thing I'll show you too. This is one that I get I think someone had a question on ROI at one point too, and I think this is an important. So if I come here and I pick a project, benefits, employee portal, these are my projects. If I click on PrismHR, what I see here is this little graph. And what I can see is total test cases, hold for review. These are just different categories that we built into a custom field. But what this is showing me is I have 7,000 test cases that I've deprecated. 90 days ago, I had 6,900. And I come over here to my release work test cases. Today, I have 4,041 test cases. 90 days ago, I had 3,576 test cases that were marked as that. One of the things with TestRail, of course, is once you change a field, it's changed. So what I can't tell, if I went into TestRail and said these test cases are in this section, and now I move it to this section, and I run a report, it's not going to tell me where that test case was 90 days ago. It's telling me where that test case is today. So that's what this stuff is doing for me. So a lot of people will come in here and say, I want to know how many test cases, how many regression test cases have we built up in the past 90 days? Well, we have 373 now. We have 372 30 days ago. We had 350, and they had 349. And if I click on additional information, of course, it takes me back to that particular project. But so we do things like that as well, because this is something that the reporting can't do. It really can't give me a snapshot of what my TestRail project looked like 30 days ago, or 60 days ago, or 90 days ago. We record these numbers daily for that reason. We literally, again, we use the TestRail APIs. I pull all this information out, we dump it to a database. And then we use that same Grafana here to pick this stuff up.
That's super helpful to see. Yeah, I think from my experience and customers I've talked with, the reporting starts to get helpful if you are able to do the reporting on the project level. It's real-time data. It's typically reports that are helping to drive release decisions, or maybe you can do some look back, especially when you're looking at historical test results, not fields or things like that. Test results is the one area where we've got that historical look back to see, kind of on these different runs or on this different activity, what was the history of that test. I think a couple of the, but they're definitely more like built-in reports that are tied to some specific QA metrics, like the defect report. You can upload to TestRail, you can upload a list of all of your JIRA IDs for a specific sprint or project. You can add those, and you can look and see how many of those are you actually covering with your TestRail tests, as long as you're using that reference field in TestRail. How many of those are actually covered with TestRail tests? What's the latest status? How many of those aren't covered? It's a little bit more manual. If you don't want to go the API route, there's also the defect report, similar deal. If you download a list of all of the JIRA IDs of your bug reports for a specific sprint, pull that into TestRail, just upload that list of IDs. You can look and see what's the latest status of testing. But it's a good question, and I'll tell you too, from the product side, it's definitely something we're looking to improve upon. So Mike, thanks for the great questions there. I want to go maybe 5-10 minutes tops more. There's one or two other questions that I want to make sure that we get in, and then we'll break and let you get back, because I know you've got a release coming up pretty soon here too yourself. One of the attendees asked a question, and I'll put it in the chat right now so everybody can see it. I use Test Cafe for automating web app testing, and it sounds like they actually use a reporter plugin to Test Cafe to send tests to TestRail, which I don't know if you're familiar at all with that. And their experience with that plugin was that it doesn't have the provision for specifying a test run, so that every time the tests are executed in Test Cafe, what it's doing is it's creating a new test run in TestRail. So I think, I'm not sure that you're familiar with Test Cafe in particular, but I'm curious to hear how your team handles sending test results and with test runs. Do y'all, I know you kind of wrote the process yourself. Do you create a new test run every time you run an automation run and send those results to TestRail, or are you sometimes polling TestRail for open test runs and then just adding new results within open test runs? Or how do you specify the test cases that are being executed and which test run to execute them in, if at all?
Sure. So I'm not too familiar with Test Cafe. I've seen a demo of it. I have not written any tests in it or had to work with it personally, but I will tell you that what we do is again, I think during the demo, you guys saw that I had this thing called build and run, and build and run is go build a plan, add these tests, and run it. And if you actually looked at that, what I didn't get into is there was a checkbox that said run later, right? Or execute immediately, or one of those options. And what that allowed us to do is if you uncheck that, you could say, I want to build this plan, but I don't want to run it right now. I just want to build it, because my manual testers may come and add stuff to it. Because one of the things that we definitely realize is, even though manual testing will never go away, nor should it. Automation is there to make sure your manual testers are focusing on things that they can. So we often will want to build a plan, but not run it immediately. Or in our case, and this has another question, someone had asked about a retest. Why do I mark it as retest? Well, the reason why we do that is because our framework allows you to pass it a TestRail ID. And outside of our test framework, the first thing you do is when you pass it a test ID, we have a small block of code in our Python that says, hey, given that TestRail ID you just gave me, call the TestRail APIs to look at that run, to get a list of all the test cases, figure out which ones of those are actually automated, figure out which ones of those are not already set to pass so that I don't rerun unnecessary tests, collect all of those tests, case numbers, and pass that list off to my framework. The framework that says, oh, those are the cases you want me to run. I could have 10,000 tests in my test framework. I only want to run these 150 that relate to this plan. That's why we mark it. So when you rerun, you may say, hey, go rerun the same, because we all know Selenium sometimes is a little flaky, doesn't always work, or we may run and then the developer says, okay, I just updated the configuration. Can you rerun those tests? So absolutely, I don't want to have to rerun. I don't want a new plan. I don't want a new run. I just want to rerun all of those things that were set to retest so that I can then do it. Now, that plugin that was referred to probably has something like that built into it. And therefore it doesn't, so you can't manipulate that. The best way to do it is to kind of write your own. You have to write something that says, yes, given this information, I want to build that plan, or I want to look for an existing plan that has this ID. Get that list. And how do we handle updating that plan when we're done? There are two ways to do updating of the test runs. There's the TestRail recommended way, and then there's the way that we do it, which I'm actually going to say is not better. It's just different. And there are some drawbacks to it. So what happens is your test framework can keep track of all the test cases it passed and failed. When you're finally done, your test framework produces a report of which one of those passed and which ones of those failed. You can then call an API, call the TestRail API that says, go find this run. Here are a list of the cases inside that run. Here are the list of the test cases that failed. Here are the list of tests that passed. Please go update them accordingly. That's the recommended way. And I actually recommend that you guys do that out of the gate because it makes less API calls that way. The reason why what we do is while our test framework is running, every test in real time, we don't wait for the report. We wait as each test passes and fails, we make an API call to update it. Now, again, remember, if you're using the standard cloud configuration, you have a pro license and not an enterprise license, you're limited to 180 calls a minute. So depending on how big and how many tests you're running, because we can run up to 25 servers at once and so forth, you're making a lot of calls to that server. And the only thing that really gets you is that you can see the things passing and failing in real time. So unless there is a need to know right this second where you are, versus if your automation takes 20 minutes to run, in 20 minutes, you're just going to get an update. So back to the original question, is the problem with that plugin is that plugin, it has a built-in way of doing things. So if that plugin, you're giving it, this is what I want to do. Here's a list of the test cases I want to run. It's handling building the run, running the run, and updating. It's handling all that for you under the covers. We basically more or less wrote our own plugin. We don't call it a plugin, but we wrote our own code that calls the APIs directly. And that's why we're able to say, here's the run, extract what to run, then update those test cases on that run. And that's why I can rerun that same run over and over again, and hopefully more and more will go from pass to fail. And again, why don't we fail it? Because honestly, we don't always know it's a failure, right? It's a retest. We want to go look at it. Was it Selenium? Was the server down? Was there a problem? We go and look. And then if we manually verify that there's actually a product issue, that's when we fail the test versus just automatically failing it. Automation sometimes is, especially Selenium and UI automation, is just too temperamental to automatically fail.
That was great. Super helpful. Thank you. All right. Last question, lightning round, biggest question, shortest amount of time to answer.
Oh boy.
How do you think about the ROI for your test automation? How did you convince PrismHR that it was worth doing all of this work to have all of this running?
Oh boy. So yeah, ROI is always one of those very difficult things to track, especially because and same with QA, right? Just QA in general. Because the better we do our job, the less bugs go out. Less bugs that go out, you know, why, right? What do we have this huge QA for? We don't even have bugs. It just always runs, right? So we cut back on QA, then it's a cycle. The only thing I can say is the best way to do it is get your automation engineers and QA engineers to work hand in hand, especially if they're the same group. Because what you want to do is every time you find a bug, if automation catches it, you want to let the QA engineer almost take credit for it. It's their team, but they'll go back and say, thank God automation was there because they caught it. And a lot of times, especially if it's what you keep posting is saying QA, and this isn't always true, but a lot of times it is true, we wouldn't even have run those tests. If those tests weren't automated, we wouldn't have run them because we were too busy doing this. So every time automation does catch a bug, the best way is just to bring it up. Automation caught that bug, and we wouldn't have run it manually because we didn't have the time. And every time manual testing catches a bug, you have to say, well, manual testing caught that bug because they had time to test it because they weren't over here running all these regression tests because automation was doing it for us. You just have to keep touting that line. Is the best way. Most people realize that there is a return on investment on automation. It just takes a little while, especially when you start and you have 15 automated tests and you don't have hundreds of automated tests. And it's very counterintuitive sometimes. And I know I'm going over a little bit of time, but people ask the question, you know, what do I automate first? And honestly, what you automate first is the most reliable things to get your automation off the ground. That way, you know your infrastructure is solid. I can click that button. I know my automation framework will run. I know my problems are not in my infrastructure. If you're always constantly debugging your infrastructure and not the tests themselves, people will view automation as unreliable. So you start with the most reliable tests so that you work out the bugs in your infrastructure. Once your infrastructure is very reliable, then you can switch your focus from reliable tests to things that you really think you need to be testing more often. So it's that's how you kind of build it when you first start growing. And then once you really get sophisticated, I'm going to say you're almost one sprint behind. You want to be automating the most recent features. Yeah, sure, we can all go automate a feature that went out the door 2 years ago. Chances are it's not going to break. That new feature that went out last quarter, that's the thing that probably has the biggest chance of breaking next quarter, because someone's added some patches. It was part of a larger epic that we needed to do, and it's just part of. So honestly, I always you start with the known good features that you know are very reliable, and you're probably not going to catch anything, but you worked out the bugs in your software, meaning that the infrastructure software, and then you start saying new features, that's the next thing to do. And that's what's going to start giving you bugs to find.
Well done. That's great. Yeah, 2 minutes over, but that's not a problem. Only I just hope that it didn't take too much time back from your day. So thanks again to everyone for joining. If you can real quick before you sign off, throw a quick note in the chat, just letting us know how this went off for you. This was an experiment for us as well as for Mike. Mike, thank you so much again for your time. Good luck with the release over the next couple of weeks here. And we'll be in touch about any other follow-up items. I will just say last time on this recording, we are going to send a link out for this recording as well as the link to the recording of the webinar. The webinar link went out yesterday. We'll send another follow-up today or early next week with the link to this recording. And we'll probably also, Mike, I'll chat with you first about it, but it might be fun to post this in the forum, the community forum too.
Sure, yeah.
That way, if users have any questions or anything like that, we can keep the dialogue going. But Mike, you're doing awesome work. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with the community here, and look forward to seeing you again on another chat or something, or in the forums.
All right, good, perfect. Look forward to it.
Enjoy the weekend.
Thanks.
All right,
Bye, everyone.
Bye.